Welcome to Unite Now, where we bring unity to you, wherever you are.
Well, hello everyone. I'm Agatha and I run ad sales at Unity, and I'm joined here by Paul, CTO of Adjust, the world's best in class mobile measurement provider. In this session, we'll be covering the user acquisition strategies of hyper casual games. So let's get started. So before we dive in, Paul, would you mind introducing yourself briefly?
Absolutely. And first of all, thanks for having me. As already mentioned, I'm a CTO and co-founder of Adjust, and Adjust is a mobile measurement partner. So we do mobile attribution, and we've been doing this for a while now. We're founded in 2012, and by now we have over 15 offices and over 500 employees worldwide. Um, and we provide service to some of the biggest and most modern app publishers. And one of the kind of things that we want to touch upon today is that we provide the measurement backbone for many of the hyper casual publishers that are publishing new apps every week and are heavily relying on the data to actually get their performance just right. And these are also the clients that really helped us push forward the next wave of technology that we're seeing in the UA space, which is automation, which we're going to talk about today as well.
Awesome. And I already introduced myself. I'm Agatha, and we actually partnered Unity and Adjusted specifically on this market, and released an amazing report full of a ton of comprehensive data to uncover the latest trends and industry stats of this booming hyper-casual market. So today we'll be able to take you through some of the highlights from that report and discuss what's going on. So with that, we'll go through a quick agenda. Paul, you already covered a little bit about what Adjust does, but hopefully you can dive in a bit further. And then we can go into the current state of hyper-casual games, learning from hyper-casual strategies, and then finally having a discussion around these trends and looking a little bit more into the future. So with that, is there anything else you'd want to add about Adjust technology and what you guys are doing in this space?
Sure. I think maybe not everyone is, intimately familiar with what an MMP does. So what we do is basically we tie together the money you spend on advertisement, right? And, the users that you show to the tab, download your app, open it, and we connect these dots. Basically, we tell you the efficiency of your ad spend. We do the ROAS calculation, if you like, and all the things that go with it, from, collecting the cost to collecting your ad revenue, all down to the most granular level available, often on the user level. And we allow hyper precise optimization of campaigns with that data, right? So instead of just running 3 or 4 campaigns that you have a rough idea what's going on, you can run thousands of super granular sub-targetings to figure out exactly what targeting, what creative works the best, which users return the most money, because it's no longer just about like figuring out how many downloads you had. It's much more about like what are the users worth that I'm actually getting, and how do they monetize, and what are they worth to me, and it just answers that question. And in our latest kind of iteration, we've started to look at what comes after the point of having the right information is applying the right information. And this is something we saw that a lot of our clients were still doing a lot of busy work, a lot of kind of manual, repetitive tasks. And our hyper casual clients were the first ones that really pushed us and said, guys, this is not sustainable what we're doing. Can you help us? And we decided to do so. And that's why we introduced our brand new product suite around automation, which is a lot of tools focused on kind of removing the manual work.
Awesome. Well, I'm excited for us to talk about a little bit more about those in a bit. But before we get into that, we've used the word hyper casual probably 10 times already. And it gets thrown around in the industry a lot. But before we talk about all the things that this category is doing, let's maybe define it. So, Paul, what is a hyper casual game exactly?
So, of course, there's no textbook definition, but typically hyper-casual games are extremely lightweight, simple to understand games with a mechanic that needs no explanation. So they typically have either no tutorial or just like a 5-second tutorial, and they're extremely intuitive to play, right? That means they have a very easy or very low barrier of entry so that people can start interacting with the app right away. They monetize through advertisement. So typically they show ads as part of the experience, and they build in big interstitial ads that are providing some of the biggest supply source in our ecosystem outside the big social media apps. And they have basically narrowed down the whole kind of mechanism of getting people into the app and getting them to use the app to basically perfection. Hypercasuals are kind of the logical conclusion of a lot of mechanisms of how the store works and how people work. And they've boiled this down to like an exact science. We're going to talk about it a little bit later, and it's super interesting. But part of hyper casual games is definitely also the mechanism how they monetize and how they manage to attract new users. And these simple games are definitely much more complex and much more deep than they seem on the surface. And typically in today's hyper casual games, you can see that the polish level, so as simple as the mechanic is, the polish of the gameplay, the visual effects, the sound effects, these kind of things are extremely well made because the level of polish is one of their kind of conversion criteria. The more the polish, the higher the conversion. And so these seemingly simple games are often extremely complex in the thought that went into them that built them.
Yes, Paul, I feel like you hit the nail exactly on the head with how these games do so well in terms of how people engage and how the store works, because really the numbers speak for themselves. So the projections for estimated revenue in 2022 are 95.4 billion from this genre, with 80% of all install growth in gaming driven specifically by hyper casual games. It's just astonishing. And now, of course, you look at what's been going on in the world with the lockdowns and the whole situation with COVID. And it turns out that this genre is really what people are craving the most. So what we've seen is 103% increase in global hypercasual installs between December 2019 and March 2020, in partnership with you guys in the report. And that was all due to these worldwide lockdowns, and probably wouldn't have been possible if these games weren't so quick to pick up, and anyone stuck at home all of a sudden can download these types of apps and really get into them.
Yeah, I mean, we saw definitely this tremendous growth, but another thing that was very interesting to see is how the hyper casuals were able to adapt their mechanics, right? Because what we saw is that the ratio between paid and organic installs actually switched heavily in their favor. So typically, hyper casuals, and it's worth explaining a little bit. What I hinted at earlier is that they are kind of this conclusion of how the store works, and both Google and the Apple Store still value a lot how many new installs you have and how many people use your app. They've both changed to focus more on apps with consistent user base so that you have a chance to stay high up even if you don't have a lot of new installs. But some of these changes are still quite recent. And overall, it still gets you into the top list to get a lot of downloads in like one chunk. And that is one of the kind of core ideas that hyper casual games pursue, because the goal is to rank high in the gaming category, because stores have changed. Of course, how people use apps have changed. 6 years ago, people were still scouring the App Store to find a cool app. When I started out as an app publisher back in 2008, it was cool to go to the store to find any cool new app. Today, that is pretty much narrowed down to a few categories, but gaming is one of them, meaning often people still go like, hey, I'm locked in at home. What am I going to do all day? And so they go to the gaming category and just look at the top 10 and download a couple of the things that are for free in the top 10, because it's a free game, it's fun to play, so I'll try it if it's in the top 10. And that is the idea behind how hypercasuals push themselves into this top list to gain organic downloads. That's the organic uplift. The higher that is, the better for their business model, because these users are free. They didn't have to pay for those installs. And during the lockdown period, we could see that this ratio went from like 80% paid installs to like just 50% paid installs, which of course is absolutely tremendous for their business model. And so if we drill down a little bit more at these kind of free games, their mechanism is quite interesting. That because they've not only taken the store mechanic to its logical conclusion, they've also taken the user acquisition to its absolute extreme. That means that by monetizing through ads, they are working heavily on the supply side, but they're also some of the biggest demand side players in the market. That means they buy and sell advertisement at a margin. And very often that margin isn't extremely big, right? They have a very, very hardcore focus on the data part of the UA to make sure that this 3, 4, 5% margin that they have in is continuously kept up. And the adaptation during the lockdown period was quite interesting because, of course, as supply and demand got into quite a upheaval, we suddenly had a lot of supply. Demand shrunk a little bit until demand went up again because the hyper casuals figured, hey, at these prices, we're definitely buying. It was very interesting to see how they adapted to this whole thing in real time. So they didn't take like weeks or months to react to this. Another very interesting thing is that they don't just have all of their UA data driven. The games themselves and their design is data driven. And one of the kind of key points that they have to figure out is how many ads can I show to a user before it negatively impacts my retention. And that is very interesting. It's one of the things that our report found is that the correlation isn't exactly what you'd intuitively assume. Because you would assume, hey, the more ads I show, the less people will retain because more ads are bad. People don't want to see ads. But as it turns out, there's such a thing as too few ads. If you show too little ads, people churn faster. And if you look at this graph that we assembled, there's a very interesting kind of grouping that some of the most profitable games definitely show a relatively or a surprisingly high number of ads per session. So that you can really see that it is a global trade-off, because there's also, if you manage to show more ads over a shorter period of time, you might monetize more in the overall kind of picture. So for those guys, it's really about, okay, how do I maximize the lifetime value of my user by showing him just the right amount of ads. And there's a big science behind that. And all of these kind of things are dynamically controllable. So those guys can sit there and change the frequency, the type of ads, or even depending on how the gameplay is going, to make sure that the user sticks around as long as possible. And again, as I said, if you look at these graphs, you see some very interesting grouping that kind of demonstrates that too few ads are definitely not going to work for you, because then people just simply don't stick around and don't monetize in your app either.
Amazing. Yeah. And I feel like that's especially important for hyper casual that already sometimes do have less stickiness than maybe other types of game genres. So it's really, the business model, I think, is really fascinating. So I guess moving on, and what others can learn from these hyper casual strategies. You touched on this already a little bit, that this would be a lot for someone to have to do manually, and how automation plays such a big part in this. So what is Adjust doing to help hyper casuals, but really user acquisition managers of all kinds, be able to buy more efficiently and more easily?
I think it's kind of interesting to, for a second, they look at what does a UA manager actually do most of his day, right? Like a normal UA manager, not necessarily hyper casual. One in this, they look at the data from their attribution partner, saying, okay, this campaign works well, this campaign doesn't work so well, you should shift your budget. And this isn't usually just on the campaign level, but also on a lower level, the creatives, the individual country targetings, campaign messaging. So we're talking about something like 100 levels of granularity per network, with around 15 networks on average for a normal kind of app to be run. So that's a couple of thousand things, like it's over 1,000 things you have to change. And they have to change it in 15 different dashboards. So they go in and out of these dashboards and click these things over and over and over again. That means it typically takes them, with a well-made report that tells them exactly what they want to know, it takes them about like 5 minutes to get the information they need. And then it takes them 3 or 4 hours to actually apply the information. And that's been something that we've been looking at for a while and say, hey, that seems vastly inefficient. It's also that they didn't spend their time doing anything valuable. They don't really create value. They just do things that we felt like that could be done by a machine. And we stumbled across a small company called Agatha a while ago, and they were solving exactly that problem, where they take this optimization and have a machine input all of your decisions. So it's not that the machine makes the decisions, but you tell how your decision making is done to the machine, typically by a relatively simple rule set. And the rule set is just applied to all types of APIs, so script dashboards, everything that you can basically make work. And when the hyper casual started to become a much bigger thing a while ago, we could really see that for them, it was not optional to use it. Because where as a normal UA manager has maybe one, say 2 apps to take care of, and well, sure, that's like 5 hours of clicking stuff a day, which isn't great, but it's still doable. But now imagine that you publish a new app every week, and you have to keep up with the apps that are sometimes the good ones still have a lifetime of months or even years. And you understand that by adding 2 more zeros to this equation, it just becomes entirely unviable. Either that means you have like 100 UA managers sitting somewhere in the basement, like clicking like crazy monkeys through this thing, or you find a way to do it differently. And as I said, their margins are definitely not where you could pay 100 UA managers and still make this extremely viable. So they were the ones coming to us and go like, this looks cool, we want to use it. How far can we scale this up? And what is it that we can automate? And for them, things that we never really thought about as so tedious became things they absolutely wanted to automate, because what is something that a normal UA manager has to do once a month, they have to do once a day, or maybe even 10 times a day. And so they were like, okay, help us focus down on these things. And so what we built for them and now allow all of our clients to do is everything from like adjusting campaigns and the bids by rule engines. So where you can say, hey, if the return on invest is above this value, then increase the campaign volume by this much or reduce my bid by this much. And all of that is going to be applied automatically, right? We also, for specifically for our hyperculture clients and our enterprise level clients, we're building in our what we call Automate Enterprise, which is our kind of lab where we build new features for them. We are starting on campaign cloning, campaign transportation from one app to another. Um, we start working on creative optimization, where we help them to understand and faster change out creatives, which is an extremely manual task. If you have like 50 networks and you want to, upload 100 campaigns, you're going to spend the next 3 days just uploading creatives. And this is something that we start automating for them, and the efficiency that they get, that's the interesting thing. They don't just use it just to save money on people. That's one thing, of course, but it's not the main thing, because it's not like the automation when, say, weaving machines came about, right, where a machine could make the shirt 10 times faster than a human could. You just had more shirts. With the time we give to the UA managers, their job starts changing dramatically. So instead of just being there and just slaving away in an Excel file over and over and over again, they now actually have the time to have a creative idea. They can run much smaller campaigns to try something. If they have a thought on how to reach their users or re-engage them, we can definitely see this with the other part of our clients that are starting to use this technology. They come up with really quirky little ideas where they say, I have a very narrow group I want to focus on. I have very small targeting, but it might convert very well. Without automation, it is unviable to run a campaign like that. You can't spend like 3 or 4 hours every day to run a campaign targeted at 1,000 users. It will never return your investment, even if it's a great campaign. But if a computer does all of that for you and it takes you 5 minutes to set this up and perpetually run, hey, then it's a great campaign. And then you can create 100, 200, 300 campaigns of those things over time and actually run a pretty complex network of messaging and even getting people back into the app, instead of just having these huge simple retargetings. And so it is really something that we can see doesn't just like elevate the game, but it really changes what a UA manager does from a day to day. And that is something that quite interestingly came out of the simple need from the hyper casuals, just not to have to click so much anymore.
That's awesome. Yeah, there's so much exciting stuff being done in automation. I think it's going to be an exciting, I guess, series of features or paths to see in the coming years. So the next tip we have here is called "Give the people what they want." Starting obviously with already some of the things that we've been talking about around these gameplay mechanics being very simple, being intuitive, and most importantly, not really having a learning curve. So you go into the app, it appeals to a much wider user base and audience, and then you can the person come in and understand almost immediately what's going on, and that of course enables them to be able to watch ads more quickly, and actually being able to maybe discover different types of apps or different types of games already sort of within that environment. And so this is actually something that all verticals could easily benefit from by simply making their apps more easy to engage with. That the moment that you open it, you kind of get what you see, what you're getting, and you can dive right in.
It's definitely something that we also saw in the data. Did make it into a report because it was just a smaller data set. But what we saw is that their churn on the first session is actually much lower than most other apps, right? Where most apps have this kind of people that drop off within the first minute or so. That number is astonishingly low in hyper casual games. Sure, they don't retain over like months, but in the very short term, they've actually nailed of getting the user into the app. And another aspect of that is also something that if you want to see how App Store optimization is done well and how your the media that you display in the App Store from like video ads to like the screenshots to manage the expectations well, look at a hyper casual game, right? They got this down to a T because for them, sending someone to the store is a big part, of course, of their marketing. 80% of the users on average go that way by being pushed into the store and told, like, download this. And it's very important that the experience that you will see in the app and that you've seen in the advertisement before you went to the store kind of matches with what happens in the store, right? So you can't have like a lazy made thing that looks nothing like the app, or just something that doesn't really tell you what's going on. They have very clear, concise screenshots. They typically have really nice videos that explain how everything works. Again, polish is one of the kind of keywords here. So there's a lot more that can be learned from how they're doing these things, right? Because if you want to see how to do it the absolute optimal way, very often you just look at the big hyper casual companies, because for them, having 3 or 4% better conversion from the store in the app means millions and millions of dollars. So they have every incentive to like nail this to an absolute T. And it's definitely one of the kind of things where you can see a huge difference to how many other people look at this. Go like, yeah, I have to have some screenshots, right? The other thing is, of course, if they use deep linking in their campaigns, it's also always to the point, exactly to the experience that you're promising, right? There's no roundabout way. You don't get redirected into the app at a point where you're like feeling lost, or what I'm supposed to be here. They have a very seamless transition between showing you an experience and giving you right away the exact same experience in the app. Right? This is something that I think they pretty much learned from e-commerce. There's a lot of people actually in hyper casual that have a past in e-commerce, or very kind of similar verticals, because they were before the kind of, let's say, most advanced UA buyers, and they really figured out this whole deep linking users into the right kind of point in the app to optimize conversion. So hyper casuals took that learning and moved on with that idea.
Awesome. And I mean, I think that we've already started talking about this, but you do have that opportunity to bring people into the store and download maybe your first game. But can you talk about how publishers can maybe make sure that they keep people within that ecosystem for longer than just the life cycle of that single app?
I mean, that's one of the other kind of things where people think about hyper casuals as short-lived games, and they are. The individual user doesn't hang out in a hyper casual game for like a couple of months, maybe a week or two, but hyper casual publishers have started looking at this in a very different kind of way. Instead of saying, okay, I have one user and one app and that's it, they've started to understand, hey, wait, I can have the same guy that really loves playing my one game here, and which will run out of steam eventually. I can transport him to the next experience, into the next small game, and keep him going. And we're calling this the snowball effect, because we can see this as some of our big hyper casual clients are pushing 20 to 30 million users in front of them whenever they publish a new app. They have this much firepower to say, okay, I want to bring this app into the #1 slot, so I get a maximum organic app lift. And instead of just buying new installs for money, they sometimes just go, hey, I do a cross promotion campaign and like 3 or 4 of my games that are kind of on the way out, or where you say it's a good time to transition these users out. And we can see now, with the ability to automate that they're starting on a more individual level, where they say, okay, this user shows signs of attrition. It's time to move them over to another experience and optimize the experience that they should be transported to. So they start looking at their user base as one giant user base across all of their apps, and try to understand, how can I move them around, and how can I make use of the same user over and over again. And if there's a type of game he likes playing, and I build the next version of it, it is absolutely worth trying to move him through. So where other people might think, hey, hypercasuals are not really kind of the retargeting guys, or the kind of long-term retention, it turns out they really are, as soon as you start looking at their entire base of apps as a single big publishing machine that they push their users through. And that is something that a lot of people kind of underestimate as a kind of factor, but it really helps if you want to have a new game, you want to make sure it gets #1. Otherwise, it was just not worth publishing it. And so they can often just say, look, I'll just reroute 5 million of my active players into this thing. 5 million downloads on one day will certainly do the trick to get you very high up into the top list. And that is definitely one of these kind of things where a lot of people could profit from having the same kind of point of view on these problems.
Absolutely. And I guess in order to make all these decisions, and then be able to drive users at that right place, I mean, you've obviously already talked about this, and we have, but data seems to be everything. So how can, I guess, you recommend that publishers of all types, but obviously taking learnings from hyper casuals, make data driven decisions?
I think it's the kind of, let's say, the absolute focus on everything has to be data driven. Every single thing that you see in a hyper casual app has been A/B tested. There's nothing accidental, right? From the ad that you've been shown, to go to the store page, to the first thing you see in the app, to every single screen you see later, has been tested and iterated over and over again, right? And Adjust provides the tools for our clients to be able to do that, where we allow them to see every single funnel and stream to go like, okay, this one worked better. This creative creates higher engagement in my app. If I change to this monetization rate, this yields a higher return on invest for this group of people. So it's about getting into this mindset that you can test everything and you can drive everything purely on the databases. Because very often people don't really behave as intuitive as you would think, right? Like, as I said, if you think, oh, I show them more ads, they'll definitely churn. And as it turns out, you just show them free instead of one app, you suddenly make much more money and they stay around the same time, which is nothing that you would intuitively assume. And that is true for every single thing they do, right? They never just try a creative, they test it, right? They upload 100 creatives, see which ones work better, and then iterate, iterate, and iterate. They measure how often they have to be refreshed. They measure from the messaging to the position, from the style of creative to which users to show it to. And when we look at our, let's say, broader user base, sure, there's other, UA operations that, let's say, at least aspire to the same level of dedication to like driving it by the numbers. But there's still a lot of this old school marketing that comes more from a gut feeling where you'll be like, oh, wow, I'll just try this, it'll be fine, which is usually driven by how complicated it would be to try a large number of things because you have to do it all by hand. And so this whole data driven thing really goes hand in hand with this automation thing because you can't do all of these data driven decisions by hand, unless you have a lot of free time at your hand. You really like clicking as a hobby, then I guess it's fine. But for most people, it kind of comes with, hey, I can do this automatically. Great. Then let's run these 100 experiments, see how they work, take the best ones, and just keep iterating on these kind of things.
That's awesome. Well, that brings us to the end of our tips for the industry. So we'll end on something fun. Let's take out our crystal ball and try to talk about, how do we keep these pandemic players, as they're being called, continuing to be engaged in gaming and hyper casual overall? What's your prediction for the future?
I think the same as we've seen with this whole situation, that it transforms a lot of industry at a much more accelerated pace, is probably something that we're going to see for mobile gaming as well. A lot of people for the first time picked up a mobile game, and they seem to enjoy the experience. And I think what we're going to see is the challenge to kind of give them continuously new experiences, to show to them, hey, we're catering to you with the game that you like, the mechanic that you like, is something you want to keep pushing. And we're going to see a lot of these apps basically trying to see, okay, which mechanics work well for these players. How can I make a new game? How can I keep the level of polish up? How can I, what's the right messaging to keep them, engaged and transported? And there's so many kind of little kind of nitbits that go in there. Like, do you have competitive elements? Do you have rewarding elements that give this user this kind of this little cake that they need to continue playing? And what we're going to see is a real focus on trying to continuously deliver that kind of experience. And I mean, that's true for a lot of these industries. We've seen this not just for hyper casual games, it's true for a lot of the mental health apps that have a huge new user base as well. For them, it's going to be the same challenge, right? Like, what experience can I deliver to them? And what can I do so they stick around? But I think for many of these apps, it's going to be that the user base that they gained is definitely something that they can look forward to actually keeping around.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we've seen it also in other industries. I mean, we can all remember when people are like, oh, Netflix is just a fad, or, reality TV is just a fad. And, once people start to enjoy some form of entertainment, they usually end up sticking to it. So I agree. I hope they stick around. So with that, again, thank you so much, Paul, for taking the time to do this. It's been really interesting to hear your insights on where the industry is going. And of course, I look forward to Unity and Adjust continuing to work together to ensure developers and marketers have the right tools and insights to take their businesses forward. And then to our audience, thank you for attending this Unite Now session on the state of hypercasuals. We hope that you've learned a lot and potentially incorporate some of these strategies and mindset that hypercasuals have paved ahead. As a reminder, these were highlights from a report that you can download the full report by Adjust and Unity to dive even deeper into the full analysis. You can find the download link available on the session page on unity.com/Unite Now. And finally, you can also browse other sessions on the Unite Now page. So yeah, thank you all. Thanks, Paul. And I hope to see you again soon. Thank you.